All right, everyone, welcome back. Today we're going to deep dive into something that you know, might seem pretty basic on the surface, but it trips up a lot of people in senior software engineer interviews. And that is Java wrapper classes.
Yeah, you definitely don't want to underestimate these things.
Yeah, you really don't. And I know, a lot of you out there listening are probably prepping for those tough interviews.
Absolutely. It's a competitive field out there.
It is. And you want to be ready for anything.
Anything they throw at you, yeah.
Yeah. And wrapper classes, they might not seem like much, but they can get really tricky when interviewers start asking those in-depth questions about, how they work under the hood.
Exactly. It's not just about knowing what they are. It's about understanding the why and the how and the implications.
Right. And so today we're going to break all of that down.
Yeah, really unpack it.
So just to level set real quick for anyone who needs a refresher, wrapper classes in Java, they essentially let us use those primitive data types like our ints, booleans, and so on with things like generics that normally, expect to work with objects.
Right, because you can't just throw a primitive into a generic.
Exactly. You can't have an array list of int.
Right. Yeah, you run into trouble there.
You do. And that's where wrapper classes come in. They basically wrap those primitives into objects like integer, boolean, and so on, so we can use them with all those powerful generic structures.
Yeah, they bridge the gap.
Exactly. So it's like, if you imagine you're trying to write code to store a bunch of integers in an array list.
Oh, yeah. Classic interview question.
It is, yeah. And you might think, oh, this is easy peasy array list of int, and then bam.
Compiler error.
Right. Compiler's like, nope, not going to happen.
Not so fast.
Exactly. Java generics, they need objects to work with, and our primitive types just aren't objects.
And there's a good reason for that. It goes back to how Java's design primitives are handled differently in memory compared to objects.
Right. They're kind of treated as, special citizens in a way.
Exactly. They get special treatment.
Yeah. And that's where our wrapper classes come in. They wrap those primitives up in these nice object packages so we can use them with all those cool generic structures.
Makes them play nicely with the rest of the system.
Exactly. So now we can have our array list of integer instead of just int.
Much better.
Much better. So let's say we create an array list of integer and we start adding ints to it. What happens then?
So every time you add an int, Java does this cool thing called Autoboxing, where it automatically converts that primitive int into an integer object behind the scenes.
That's pretty handy.
Oh, it's super handy. We don't have to do all that conversion manually.
And then when we need to get a value back out of the array list, it gets unboxed back into an int.
Exactly. So it goes back to its original primitive form.
Seamless almost.
Yeah, Java's doing all the heavy lifting for us.
It is. But I'm curious, this whole boxing and unboxing thing, it sounds like it could have some performance implications.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Especially if you're working with large data sets or performance critical applications, all that object creation and conversion can start to add up.
Right, because every time you box a primitive, you're essentially creating a whole new object in memory, right?
Exactly. And objects take up more space than primitives, so you got to be mindful of that.
So it's not just a matter of, using wrapper classes whenever we need them. There's a strategic aspect to it as well.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Especially at the senior level, interviewers are going to want to see that you understand those performance implications.
So it's not just about knowing the what, but the when and the why.
Exactly. And that's where, really understanding the nuances of wrapper classes comes in.
Okay, so let's talk about some of those nuances then, because I remember when I was first learning about wrapper classes, one thing that tripped me up was comparing them.
Oh, yeah, that's a classic. Gotcha.
It's not as straightforward as you might think.
Nope. Can't just use the double equals like you would with primitives.
Right, because if you use double equals with wrapper objects, you're not actually comparing the values, you're comparing the object references.
Exactly. You're checking if they're the same object in memory, not if they hold the same value.
And that can lead to some really sneaky bugs.
Oh, yeah, for sure. You could have two... Double equals would say they're not equal.
Even though they hold the same value.
Exactly. It's all about what you're comparing, the references or the actual content.
Right. So if we want to compare the actual values, we need to use the equals method.
Exactly. Equals is your friend here. It compares the content of the objects, not just their memory addresses.
So in our example with the two integer objects representing 5 equals would correctly tell us they're equal.
Yep, because it's looking at the actual number 5, not the objects themselves.
Okay, that makes a lot more sense now. So just to recap, when comparing wrapper objects, double equals for references, equals for values.
Exactly. That's a good rule of thumb.
Okay, cool. So I feel like we've covered a lot of ground here, and I think our listeners are starting to get a good grasp on wrapper classes and their nuances.
Yeah, we've hit some of the key points.
But, interviewers, they love to throw a curveball.
Oh,
So
yeah. They want to see how you think on your feet.
exactly. So let's put ourselves in the hot seat for a second.
All right, let's do it.
Imagine you're in an interview and the interviewer asks you to explain the difference between double equals and equals for wrapper objects. But they're deliberately trying to confuse you. They're throwing in all sorts of technical jargon and trying to trip you up.
Oh, yeah, I've been there.
How do you stay calm and articulate your answer clearly and confidently?
So I think the key is to really understand the underlying concepts so you can explain them in your own words without getting bogged down in the jargon.
Right, so it's not about memorizing definitions. It's about truly understanding the how and the why.
Exactly. And being able to relate it back to real world examples like we were talking about with the array list and the integers.
Right, so you can say, look, imagine we have two integer objects. They both hold the value 5, but they're stored in different places in memory. Doubly equals is going to look at those memory addresses and say, hey, these are different.
But equals is going to look at the actual content, the actual number 5, and say, hey, these are the same.
Right, and by explaining it in that way, you're demonstrating a deep understanding of the concept, not just parroting back something you memorized.
Exactly. And that's what's going to impress those interviewers.
So to all our listeners out there prepping for those senior software engineer interviews, remember wrapper classes. They're more than just a simple concept. They're a gateway to understanding some of the core principles of Java.
Absolutely. From object-oriented programming to memory management, it's all connected.
And mastering these nuances is going to help you ace those interviews and write cleaner, more efficient code.
And here's something to ponder as you continue your Java journey. How do different JVM implementations optimize the handling of wrapper classes? And what are the potential trade-offs involved? Keep exploring, keep learning, and best of luck with those interviews.
That's all the time we have for today, folks. But thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.